Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister's described reports of a supposedly fractious dinner between her and the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker as Brussels gossip. A German newspaper reported there were sharp disagreements about how quickly a deal could be done over the rights of British and EU citizens and over how much money the UK owes the European Union. Here's our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
May Day means a bikes and barrows festival in this Lancashire village. And people seem keen to peddle their politics.
OK, we want to stand still now.
The election was not the main concern here in Scorton this morning, but it seems Brexit will shape how many people vote.
If she gets an English majority, which I presume she will, it strengthens her argument, doesn't it?
Obviously it's going to be a difficult time during Brexit, and if she wants to push through and put through what we need as a country and as a government, she needs the backing and to know that she can have the support of the country with her being elected.
No, I think she called it because she knows she's going to win, doesn't she? So there's not. I think that she's covering it up with the Brexit, under the Brexit banner, really. But no, it wouldn't change the way I was going to vote anyway, I don't think. Which is Labour.
Ready to shoot?
Okay. The Tories are targeting many marginal seats like this in Lancashire, and their message that Brexit negotiations are going to be tough and that Theresa May is best placed to handle them sits at the heart of their election campaign. But this tough? A German newspaper has published an account by unnamed EU officials of a dinner held last week at number 10 between Theresa May and the EU negotiating team. It describes deep disagreements between the two sides. According to the paper, the Prime Minister and the EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, seen here before the dinner, clashed over the exit bill Britain must pay, the structure of the talks and the prospects of a quick trade deal. Apparently, Mr. Juncker left the dinner 10 times more sceptical than he was beforehand, and he found Theresa May showed no willingness to compromise. The Prime Minister was also in Lancashire today, on the stump and trying to stamp out talk of a fracas with Brussels. Is the account of the meeting true? And has Brexit already gone off the rails before the talks have even started?
I have to say that from what I've seen of this account, I think it's Brussels gossip. And just look at what the European Commission themselves said immediately after the dinner took place, which was that the talks had been constructive.
May Day means workers' solidarity for Labour, but there was no fraternity from opposition parties for a Prime Minister under pressure.
To start negotiations by threatening to walk away with no deal and set up a sort of low-tax economy on the shores of Europe is not a very sensible way of approaching people with whom half of our trade is done at the present time.
The revelations overnight show Theresa May being guilty of astonishing arrogance and complacency, that she feels that somehow the lack of any kind of deal, no free trade deal, no cooperation on police and security, that's somehow acceptable to families up and down this country.
Brexit will be a difficult dance between the UK and Brussels, and this leaked account from the EU side shows a willingness to brief about the talks to their advantage. But it also reveals that on many issues the sides are far apart and the mood is far from merry. Ben, I thought the remarks made by the Prime Minister here just within the last hour were very telling. She said that this account of a dinner ruined, of division and acrimony between her and key EU negotiators was just Brussels gossip. That is not the same as dismissing it completely and claiming that she and Jean-Claude Juncker see eye to eye on everything when it comes to Brexit, which they clearly don't. And I think the big concern for number 10 is that they want the process of Brexit to be done behind closed doors, largely in secret, whereas this sort of briefing indicates the EU have other ideas. They want a lot of public lobbying going on too. And I think this could really strain trust between the two sides even before Brexit negotiations have got off the ground.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. Ben Wright reporting.
Theresa May says it's just Brussels gossip. The explosive claims in a German newspaper of a disastrous dinner with key European figures. The Prime Minister hosted the European Commission's president in Downing Street last week. They're reported to have clashed over the cost of Britain's exit, the future of EU migrants and the likelihood of a deal. Liberal Democrats leader Tim Farron said Mrs May had showed arrogance and complacency. Our senior political correspondent Robert Nisbet reports.
It's a tale of two dinners. Last Wednesday's meeting between Theresa May and the European Commission president seemed to start well, but according to the Frankfurt Allgemeine paper, it went downhill after the embrace. Under the headline, "Appearances Can Be Deceiving," it claims Mr Juncker thought his host was in another galaxy and deluding herself as to the task ahead. None of that seemed to show as he left, but the paper claims he called Germany's Angela Merkel at 7:30 the next morning, telling her he was 10 times more sceptical than he was before. After Saturday's summit, where the EU's negotiating guidelines were approved, Sky News asked him how it went.
Could you enlighten us a little bit more on what was discussed, what was the mood? Publicly, it was a good dinner. Privately, I heard it wasn't quite so good.
Privately, everything went well, but in fact, we have a problem. Because the British want to leave the European Union, and it's not feasible that this can be done just like that. It will take time, and we had to discuss a certain number of the elements we will have to address in the next coming months.
Campaigning in Stockport today, the Prime Minister acknowledged those challenges.
It is going to be quite tough, so probably it will take 2 years. 2 years, yes. That was triggered, obviously, at the end of March.
But the report in a respected centre-right newspaper contains detail which suggests a senior EU source. It claims the two sparred over the divorce settlement, with Mr Juncker concluding she was unprepared for the negotiations.
Hi, morning.
At the start of an election campaign, this is manna for opposition leaders.
Of course they're going to be difficult, but you start from the basis that you want to reach an agreement. You start from the basis that you have quite a lot of shared interests and values. We have a very important trading relationship with Europe. You start from that basis and show respect, you're more likely to get a good deal.
Well, Tim Farron, who said the Liberal Democrats agitating for a softer Brexit, also piled in.
The revelations overnight show Theresa May being guilty of astonishing arrogance and complacency, that she feels that somehow the lack of any kind of deal, no free trade deal, no cooperation on police and security, that's somehow acceptable to families up and down this country.
Before the party faithful in Lancashire, the Prime Minister first dismissed the report, then tried to turn it to her electoral advantage, pitching herself as a steely negotiator.
I have to say that from what I've seen of this account, I think it's Brussels gossip. When it comes to June the 8th, people have a clear choice. There'll be 27 European countries on one side of the table. Who do they want to see standing up for Britain on the other side? Me or Jeremy Corbyn?
With elections coming up in France, Germany and the UK, and as the negotiations draw closer, both sides are starting to sharpen their language. Robert Nisbet, Sky News, Westminster.
It was all smiles outside Number 10 on Wednesday night as Theresa May met with EU President Jean-Claude Juncker. But behind those smiles and the walls of Downing Street, a different story is beginning to emerge. According to reports in a German newspaper, Mr Juncker is said to have left the dinner feeling 10 times worse about the prospects for the Brexit talks than when he arrived. But as our political correspondent Emily Morgan reports, the Prime Minister dismissed it all as Brussels gossip.
It looked cordial enough, at least that was before their meeting on Wednesday evening. Theresa May greeted Jean-Claude Juncker in Downing Street for Brexit talks, but how did they really go? The German newspaper claims to have the full story, and it's not pretty. The leaked account describes how they disagreed on whether there'd be a quick trade deal and clashed over the final divorce bill. It reports the European Commission president left that night 10 times more sceptical than he was before. Campaigning in the northwest today, the Prime Minister, who's also accused of having unrealistic expectations, denied the discussions were in any way tense.
I have to say that from what I've seen of this account, I think it's Brussels gossip. And just look at what the European Commission themselves said immediately after the dinner took place, which was that the talks had been constructive. But it also shows that actually these negotiations are at times going to be tough.
So Downing Street's version of events couldn't be more different. They say they simply don't recognise the account given by the paper and insist that talks were constructive. But if, as reported, Mr Juncker does refuse to keep negotiations confidential, they could continue to give ammunition to the opposition. Reports that Mr Juncker now fears the negotiations will end in failure is, according to Labour, the worst possible outcome.
We have a very important trading relationship with Europe. You start from that basis and show respect, you're more likely to get a good deal. Whereas if you start with the megaphone and calling people silly names, it's not a great start to anything.
The Lib Dem leader too chided the Prime Minister for putting livelihoods at risk.
The revelations overnight show Theresa May being guilty of astonishing arrogance and complacency, that she feels that somehow the lack of any kind of deal, no free trade deal, no cooperation on police and security, that's somehow acceptable to families up and down this country.
Whether they're true or not, such disclosures threaten to sour the mood between London and Brussels, and that's even before negotiations have begun.
And Emily is here. So, Emily, where do relations stand tonight between the two sides, do you think?
Well, I would say they are probably pretty strained. Yes, Theresa May has come out and dismissed these leaks as Brussels gossip, but what she didn't do is come out and say her and Mr Juncker are in complete agreement about everything, that they are on the same wavelength. They are quite clearly not. You only have to look at what the German Chancellor Angela Merkel said last week about Britain having illusions about the sort of benefits it could keep from the EU to see or to know that these reports are probably not too far off the mark. On the one hand, this could play really quite nicely for Theresa May. Voters could think, oh, we need a strong negotiator for these tough negotiations. But on the other hand, the difficulty she has is that she wanted all these talks to remain private, to be completely secret, and that is transparently not going to happen. Brussels are obviously quite prepared to brief to their advantage, to leak to their advantage, and that could really frustrate the UK position and indeed the whole process.
OK, Emily, thank you very much.
Number 10 insists that talks on Brexit with the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker were useful and constructive. They dismissed reports that the dinner with Theresa May last week descended into disaster. A detailed account, though, leaked to a German newspaper, claims Mr Juncker emerged declaring he was 10 times more sceptical than he was before. Opposition leaders said it showed the government had no clue. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, is in the Lancashire village where Theresa May spoke a couple of hours ago. Michael.
Well, Christian, anybody who thought that the Brexit negotiations were going to be secret better think again. Downing Street have dismissed this account, but it does have a ring of truth about it, and certainly a huge amount of detail about what Mr Juncker and Mrs May said to each other. Also, detail about apparent strains between Mrs May and her Brexit secretary, David Davis, over a court case that he took against her when he was a backbencher some years ago. All this, of course, but politically, it augurs not very well, of course, for the Brexit deal, but politically, in terms of the election, it's probably actually quite good news for Mrs May, because this report fits in with the image she's trying to get across of being a strong leader, of course, the phrase we keep hearing again and again, who's willing to stand up to the Europeans. All this on the day when the bank holiday, when the Labour movement traditionally celebrates its past, the unfortunately named, you might think for them, May Day. Well, I began May Day earlier in the Lancashire town of Burnley with the unions and the Labour Party.
They've marched through Burnley on May Day for 40 years. Last year, Jeremy Corbyn was their guest. This year, the man whom many tip to succeed him. And the German report of the May-Juncker dinner is bad news, says Keir Starmer.
She's complacent and she's not listening to what is being said by our EU partners. This has to be a negotiation in which we reach the right deal. And that's why I say, it's all very well her saying I'm strong, but being strong and being wrong doesn't help this country.
Julie Cooper took this seat from the Lib Dems 2 years ago with a 3,000 majority.
Do you think your chances would be better if Keir Starmer was the Labour leader?
But you know, I always say it's a bit like your football team, you know. Your managers come and managers go. The Labour Party's not about any one single
Managers
person.
come and managers go. Well, football managers last about 6 months.
Not the case in Burnley.
Many onlookers are even less impressed with the Labour leader.
How do you think Labour's going to do in the election?
Hopefully well. Hopefully.
What do you think of Jeremy Corbyn?
I can't say on camera.
Really? Why not?
I'll tell you.
I don't like Jeremy Corbyn for a start.
Why not?
Because he's quite scruffy to represent our country, to be
He's
honest.
scruffy?
Yeah. Never
Does it
wears
really-
a tie.
Does that matter?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does.
What about politically?
He's wrong as well, isn't he?
In what way?
Nuclear free.
Corbyn and May. I think I might go May.
Why?
She's stronger.
30 miles away, Theresa May was due to visit the village of Maudsley. These friends both voted Labour last time, but she's now switched.
She voted until 2020.
Yeah, but not by the public, she wasn't, was she?
Well, the party was. I didn't realise as we were voting for one person. I thought we voted for a party, you know. Well, it seems like we vote like for a president now, don't we?
Do you think Corbyn's capable of leading the country? And
Yeah, he's got a lot of people behind him, hasn't he?
Addressing activists again with the quasi-presidential backdrop, which doesn't even mention her party, Mrs May dismissed the German press report.
From what I've seen of this account, I think it's Brussels gossip. And just look at what the European Commission themselves said immediately after the dinner took place, which was that the talks had been constructive. But it also shows that actually these negotiations are at times going to be tough. And in order to get the best deal for Britain, we need to ensure we've got that strong and stable leadership into those negotiations. And as I say, every vote for me and my team will strengthen my hand in those negotiations.
Strong leadership again. We lost count of how many times she said it. Repetitive? That may be, but it seems to be working.
Well, the leaked account of Mrs May's dinner with Mr Juncker suggests the two sides could hardly be further apart on every key issue at stake and on the speed at which any kind of agreement can be reached. Let's go through it in detail. Siobhan Kennedy is in Downing Street. Siobhan.
Well, Krish, what an insight into how these negotiations between Theresa May and her counterparts in Europe might go. This is all about a dinner here at number 10 on Wednesday night between the Prime Minister and Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission. Now, number 10 insists it was a constructive meeting, but details have gradually started to leak about the tone of those dinner talks, and it seems they were neither pleasant nor constructive. According to EU Commission sources who briefed a well-known German newspaper, there were multiple awkward moments around the dinner table, the first being the timing of a reciprocal deal to agree rights for EU citizens here in the UK and Brits living on the continent. Now, Theresa May told Mr Juncker she thinks a deal can be agreed by the end of June, no problem. But Mr Juncker, reportedly aghast at this suggestion, told her it was far too ambitious because it's not just about residency rights, but it's about other complex issues too, like healthcare, for example. He reportedly told her, "I think you are underestimating that, Theresa." Then there was also trouble reportedly around the sequencing of talks. Theresa May said she wanted to talk about a trade deal first and then agree any monies owing to the EU after. But Mr Juncker reminded her that the divorce talks must come first, including an agreement on monies owed to the EU, and only then can talks on a trade deal begin. In fact, things got rather heated at that point, reportedly, and he told them that if no money to the EU was agreed up front, then there would be no trade talks at all. Let us make Brexit a success, the Prime Minister implored over the dinner. But given the UK will no longer be in the EU or even in the customs union, Brexit cannot be a success, Mr Juncker told her.
Now, obviously, this account is the European one. It may be a little biased, but I mean, where does it leave relations now?
Well, yes, not the most successful evening for the Prime Minister when her guest, in his parting shot here behind me, doesn't praise the cuisine, Krish, but instead tells her, "I'm leaving Downing Street 10 times more sceptical than I was before I came." It's clear this was a pretty ugly bust-up which has laid bare the differences between the two sides and the tricky path that will now follow. Now, Theresa May has said today, you heard that she doesn't recognise this version of events, and she's sticking to the line that the talks were constructive. No doubt there's an element of brinkmanship here. The Prime Minister is wanting to be seen to be tough from the outset, both for her Eurosceptic colleagues and the pro-Brexit press. But, Chris, she needs to be careful that she's not so tough that she ends up with no deal at all.
Siobhan Kennedy in Downing Street. Well, earlier I spoke to the former Conservative Party leader and, of course, one of the leading Brexiteers in the referendum campaign, Ian Duncan Smith. And I put it to him that these sorts of leaks would make negotiations tricky.
Well, as Theresa May's already said, there are going to be difficult moments in the negotiations. I must say, though, I would have assumed they would do this kind of stuff, because what they're trying to do is to offer up their position, to destabilise the other side. It's what people get up to all the time, pre-negotiation, and this is very much it. I will, however, say that I think this shows a certain amount of disrespect for what was essentially a private meeting. I have no idea, as Theresa May's office has said, this bears no relation to anything that they have a record of. So you only have to assume that someone wants to make trouble, but the reality is there is no trouble, because this is all pre-negotiation guff, really, at the end of the day. So it should be put in that basket, and then we'll get on with the negotiations when Theresa May gets re-elected as a strong and stable leader.
Oh, you had to get it in, didn't you? All right, well, but, I mean, there is a lot of trouble, because the key quote from Juncker seems to be, you know, Brexit cannot be a success. And obviously that's their position, because they don't want anyone else to leave. So they are going to make it hard.
Well, I think, there is a genuine, quiet, behind-the-scenes division between what the Commission thinks it wants, and I honestly, genuinely believe what the Council of Ministers, representing the nations, probably wants. And the reality is that for both sides, we are the single largest trading partner for the whole of the European 27 nations. The reality is that they have a need to do a deal with us, and we have a need and a desire to do a good trade arrangement with them. That's the common sense position that we will look to get to at that single point. So what happens at the moment hasn't any bearing on that, for the very simple reason that we haven't started.
Well,
so
the point is that this quote, that Brexit cannot be a success, reveals that there is politics, as well as the common sense position of it's in everyone's interest to make a deal. And the politics is that they want to punish Britain, or some of them do, at least, and that means they will be prepared to take the pain. And that's why they're saying it's now more likely there won't be a deal at all.
Of course there are some people, I'm sure, out there in the European Union that would cut their noses off to spite their faces. But I don't genuinely believe that is exactly what the majority opinion is. When you get down to the discussions, what both sides ultimately want and need is a decent relationship after we leave, one based on good trade, good arrangements, good cooperation, defence, intelligence, all those things are part of the pot, and I think that's where they'll get to. This sort of stuff is all aimed at pre-negotiation, you know, annoyance, but it doesn't really get any further. It'll all be forgotten once we start the negotiations.
OK, well, can you guarantee that if people vote Theresa May back into office, freedom of movement will end in March 2019?
Well, Theresa May has been very explicit about this. She has said our baseline is that we take back control of our borders, our money, and our laws. And those three things are what basically I believe people voted for last year. But around all of that, there is this desire to have an arrangement. So that's controlled migration. Not an end to migration, but it's controlling migration so that we can get the right numbers, we have the right people and the skills, but we don't have some of that.
But there's no question of in the transitional deal there being some sort of extension of freedom of movement. You can guarantee that, can you?
Listen, no. Again, here we go. The whole point about this is that they've yet to sit down and do the negotiations. Until they sit down and negotiate what the elements of those are, beyond those three things, and those are very explicit: control of our borders, control of our laws,
but this could go on
and
for
ultimately
years.
Control of our money. Well, no, not unless you have 2 years to do it in, and they know they have 2 years to do it in.
I mean, I note that you're unable to guarantee that freedom of movement will end in March 2019. That's interesting. But I mean,
No, I'm not guaranteeing. I'm not guaranteeing anything. I'm simply saying to you, everything is guaranteed at the end of the 2 years. In other words, you have a 2-year negotiation, and at the end of that, or before the end of that, you will have a settlement, and that settlement then will be put back to the Parliament, as Theresa May has said.
Ian Duncan Smith, thank you very much.